Hello everyone, and welcome to this video where I'm going to really discuss the role that foods can play as an antidepressant. And it's based on a paper that got published in 2018 in the Journal of Psychiatry. But before we dive into this, if you don't know who I am, my name is Alex Manos. I am one of the co-founders here at HealthPath, and I have a master's in personalized nutrition, and I certified with the Institute for Functional Medicine in 2016. Now, this is the paper that I want to briefly summarize today. What the authors did was they conducted a systematic literature review to come up with a list of antidepressant nutrients from the 34 nutrients that we know are essential to our health. What they then did was they pulled nutritional data from a long list of foods to really come up with a bit of a scoring system, which they referred to as the antidepressant food score, to help us understand what foods might be most associated with improvement or prevention, I guess, of depression. So the 12 antidepressant nutrients that came out of that systematic literature review were folate, iron, omega-3 fatty acids, magnesium, potassium, selenium, thiamine, vitamins A, B6, B12, and C, and also zinc. And the authors speculated that there were at least 3 potential mechanisms by which these nutrients and foods might provide antidepressant properties. For example, with omega-3, zinc, and magnesium, we know that these promote the expression of something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And this is a molecule that can have a positive influence on neuroplasticity. We also know that food, as the authors describe, is a modifiable determinant of systemic inflammation. Now, we've known for a while now that chronic systemic inflammation is a key driver of depression. And therefore, if we can use food as a way to modify that systemic inflammation, it is going to have a positive outcome. The third and final mechanism they discuss is around the gut microbiome, and I guess more specifically, the gut-brain axis. Some of these foods, either as a result of them being an excellent source of some of these nutrients, or because of the polyphenols and phytonutrients within these foods, we know both of these things influence the gut microbiome and therefore can influence the gut-brain axis, and that will help regulate mood, cognition, and anxiety. So, to get to the chase, this is the list of foods that they shared in a table published in the paper, and they broke it down into animal foods and plant foods, and you can see the antidepressant food score that was attributed to each food here as well. So in the animal foods, oysters came out on top, followed by liver and organ meats like spleen, kidneys, or heart, poultry giblets, and then you can see down the list we've got things like octopus and crab and goat, tuna, fish roe, salmon, and then in the plant foods, watercress came out on top, followed by spinach, certain greens, lettuces, Swiss chard, fresh herbs, chicory greens. You'll see cauliflower, red cabbage, broccoli, sprouts, butternut squash lower down this list as well. So one simple takeaway would ultimately be that we want to be incorporating more of these foods into our diets. Now, I'm aware that things aren't always that simple. But if we keep this nutrition-centric, there are a couple of things that I just want to touch on. And it comes from the fact that the authors of this paper gathered their data from evaluating 100 grams of each of these foods in the raw form. And they say they did this because various cooking methods can alter the nutrient content, the nutrient bioavailability, and the water contents of foods. So there's a little question I have, which is, well, why wouldn't we evaluate the foods in the most frequently consumed form And there may be reasons why that might be harder to do, but I think it's important that we just acknowledge this is how the data was gathered. And the reason why I think that's important is because in some of those plant foods, some might have concerns around what's often get referred to as anti-nutrients, things like oxalates and phytic acids and lectins, for example. So in this paper published in the Frontiers in Nutrition in 2020, the author discussed how magnesium from dark green leafy vegetables was shown to have a bioavailability of 25 to 35%. Now, if the previous paper and authors didn't take this into consideration, it might mean that some of those plant-based foods would not score as highly as they do, or vice versa. They might actually score higher because, as you'll see, there are things that can positively influence the bioavailability of some of these nutrients. The author also discusses how the absorption of magnesium can be inhibited by oxalate. Oxalate is found in relatively high quantities in spinach. So if we think about this, we need to be mindful that spinach was, according to the previous study, the second most effective food in some ways. So the author in this paper discussed how oxalic acid can form indigestible complexes at physiological pH levels. And it's been shown, apparently, that the addition of oxalate-rich vegetables to the diet resulted in negative zinc and magnesium balances. However, the author didn't cite the study which showed this, which is interesting, I guess, considering the author cited a lot of other comments that were made. So the question starts to be, well, how much can we take from this previous study, which shows things like kale and Swiss chard and spinach to be effective? The author goes on, though, to say that there are other compounds that might have negative consequences for human health apart from oxalates, which, as already mentioned, are phytic acid, are lectins, trypsin and protease inhibitors, tannins and cyanogens. Now, the author does make the point that these anti-nutrients can be removed or inactivated by various food processing procedures, such as boiling. And I think this could be a really important point. So we go back to our list from the paper that got published in the Journal of Psychiatry, and we can say, okay, well, maybe if we were to just gently and relatively quickly boil or steam the spinach, maybe we can make some of those nutrients more bioavailable. So we need a balanced argument. There are lots of people that will, I guess, provide quite a strong argument that we should be completely avoiding foods high in oxalates and lectins and things like this. But the research just doesn't really align with that, especially human research. And even if you just look around, it doesn't necessarily make a huge amount of sense. So in this paper, which was co-authored with Deanna Minich, who has actually been on the Health Path podcast, they concluded around oxalates that despite the demonization of oxalates and promotion of a low oxalate diet in kidney stone patients, more recent observational studies of dietary patterns may prompt a re-evaluation of current guidelines. These authors are saying that even those with kidney stones may not have to be as concerned as it is currently led to believe. So if you don't have kidney stones or at risk of kidney stones, should we be concerned at all? Certain segments of the population do seem to be at greater risk of increased oxalate excretion, and consuming oxalate-rich foods may play a possible role in kidney stone formation, but other factors may play a larger role, and they include preparation techniques, calcium intake, endogenous oxalate production, and intestinal health. Oxalate can be produced by a certain species of Candida, for example. You can run something like an organic acid test from the Great Plains Laboratory to look at oxalic acid in the urine. It will also look at markers of mold and fungi metabolites to see whether there could be a Candida albicans overgrowth contributing to an elevated level of oxalic acid in the urine. Intestinal health. There's an association between oxalate hyperabsorption and inflammatory bowel disease, for example. And then just preparation technique, as we say, if you boil or steam your kale or your spinach, for example, or if you soak other types of foods overnight, like certain nuts maybe, this can significantly reduce the amount of oxalate in the food and that you absorb. And therefore, I think we have to have this balanced argument, and we have to be aware of the strategies that can reduce our intake and exposure, as well as the sort of endogenous things that will influence this as well. What I have sometimes concerns around is people who are on quite restrictive diets who could be not getting enough nutrients such as calcium, which could then be influencing their intake, or someone who's having huge amounts of green smoothies with a bag of spinach or some kale in raw form in there, who are dairy free and maybe not getting appropriate amounts of calcium, just as some examples that I think are relatively common in the modern world. Cooking oxalate-rich foods, as well as consuming adequate calcium potassium, demonstrates efficiency in significantly minimizing available soluble oxalate from dietary sources. And then don't forget that there are numerous other health properties and beneficial compounds from some of these foods. And it's such a good point they make in this paper, I think, because I see time and time again in clinic that people remove one food from their diet for one specific reason, but have forgotten that there might be 10 reasons and health benefits of consuming that same food. So you have to weigh up the pros and cons, and normally you're going to have more pros. So my takeaway is very simple. We should always be taking a food-first approach to our health. The synergy of nutrients found in food is very hard, if not impossible, to mirror in supplement form. Take oysters, which came out on top of the animal list. You have a great ratio of zinc to copper. If you supplement zinc at too high a dose for too long, you can induce a copper deficiency. Nature is far more intelligent than us and has provided us with these sorts of ratios, making a food-first approach always the best way to go. So eat a whole food, varied diet to the best of your ability. Focus on in-season and local produce wherever possible. And we have to appreciate, especially within the context of depression, that diet is a small piece of a very large puzzle when it comes to this. There are numerous areas of our lives that are going to positively or negatively influence how we feel. And therefore, in someone who has an unhealthy diet and has numerous nutrient deficiencies as a result, they are obviously going to experience a much more positive shift in mood with dietary changes to someone who eats a pretty healthy nutrient-dense diet, but is also struggling with depression. I know that might sound like common sense to a lot of you, but I think it's something that sometimes isn't thought through thoroughly all the time. So I hope that's been helpful. I hope that's been informative. I hope it's given you maybe some foods that you're not currently eating that you can start experimenting with and trying to add to your diet. If you have any comments or questions, I'd love to hear from you, and you can leave them in the comments below. Thanks, everyone.